Okay, so we gathered for another sculpture forum. We've been to see an exhibition of work by Eva Hesse, the legendary Eva Hesse. 5 pieces at the Hauser and Wirth gallery. And I'm with the usual crew, the wonderful Jock, the incredible Brandt, Junceau, and we're honored to have with us on this occasion the artist Emily Nunn. Thank you, Emily, for joining us. And all of this is being filmed and recorded and will be edited by Rachael Bohlander. Thank you, Rachael. So I saw an exhibition of Eva Hesse's work at the Guggenheim Museum in 1972. And at the time, I was not knocked out by it. But it clearly made a big impression on me, because when I now see this show and think about some of the things that I did in the 70s, there's a very real connection, I think. But I was unaware of it, and I was unaware of that 72 show having had any impact on me, really. Eva Hesse has become just, a pivotal figure in the way sculpture has evolved and is thought about, and I'm wonderful to be able to see these 5 pieces now and think about them again. What did you all think? Anybody? Would you like to start, Emily?
Sure, I can start. Thank you for having me. So this is the first time I've seen these works in person myself. So I've learned a lot and heard about these stories of shows in the 70s. And so for me to have this opportunity to see them face on was just very compelling. And I'm just astounded by the absence of any content in the work and it being just pure material and the process, which just, I don't feel I experience a lot now amongst other exhibitions. So it just really took me back, and also just her process and person of Eva Hesse has really influenced my work, just as a practice and as an artist practice.
I hadn't seen her work for some time, and I was most struck by how moved I was. I just found them very emotional and economical. And physically impressive. It impresses me that she worked at the kind of scale that she did when I think of the kind of spaces she was working in. And it's so easily, held at very big space. And then that crazy impression of age. I mean, it's not that old, and it just seems like it could be ancient.
Mm. Yeah, that's got something to do, I think, with the material itself and the way it has, must have evolved since the pieces were made. She was working with very delicate materials that have, I think, a limited lifespan.
I don't think those materials always age as well as they do in her work. I mean, like, I'm familiar with latex. Gosh, it's a horror. But the form in her work and the presentation is such that it sails past all that.
Yeah, and if one thinks about the context as well as the physical space in which she was working, the cultural context, the context in New York at the time. Well, I knew people who knew Eva Hesse. I never met her. She was dead, I think, by the time she died in 1970. So she'd have died very shortly after my first trip to New York. But I mean, one person, painter who shall be nameless, said, "Oh, we didn't take Eva seriously. She was just a pretty girl who hung out with Tom." I mean, that was the context. So I think, you know, it is extraordinary just how you know, unpredictable, unexpected, you know, it's without precedent, a lot of this work, you know. Yeah. Jock.
Well, yeah, I just, you're talking about 1970, and that's when I was introduced to her work. And I was introduced to it by photographs. I was in college in North Carolina, not in New York City. But she's the first artist that I knew who had died. And that, you know, she sort of hit me personally, even though I never met her and all that kind of stuff. But that kind of personal is the wrong word, but that kind of attachment, I had some kind of attachment to her that started in 1970, and I was being introduced to all kinds of art at the same time, and I was excited by it all. But you know, over the past 50 years, things have changed, and I found that a lot of the sort of new and exciting stuff that was, you know, came out of the 60s, no longer holds my attention, but her work does, and I don't know really why, but there is something special about it, and you know, I've been reading this guy Yves Bonnefoy and inflicting him on my friends for a while, but I picked him up last night, and he was talking about Raphael, and he said that Raphael. In Raphael, it's a complicated story, but in Raphael, there's some sense of a consciousness encountering, confronting being. And that's that bare confrontation works. When you go from Raphael to Carracci, you know, a few hundred years later, instead of that direct confrontation, you've got a painter who makes paintings, who makes images. And for Bonnefoy, that's not as good as the direct confrontation with being. And that's alive in Hess's work for me. And it's still alive, it's still fresh, in a way that her friend Saul LeWitt, it just is a disappointment for me now.
Yeah.
This just doesn't have anything to do with minimalism or post-minimalism or anything. It's a really direct, you know, integral, self-sufficient person at work doing what they like the way they like.
Well, I think we should come back to that, but I mean, because I mean, I don't think this work would have been made outside the context of minimalism, you know. So I do think it has something to do with minimalism, but it's not minimal. I wanted to come back to Emily, who, did I hear you correctly say that the work was in a sense pure material and process and a kind of absence of content?
Yes, I did say that, and I can sort of, going on from what Jock just said, this idea of the artist working in the studio and then taking the artwork into, for example, a gallery, you're losing quite often that relationship of the direct making and the experience of making. But I feel in these works and in Hess's, you're still confronted with her presence and her experience. There's nothing else but material in in the way of what we're looking at. But something I also find interesting is originally when I first looked at these works, I thought she'd painted them and put the colors in. But going back to this idea of aging, the work has aged and it's changed in color. And so in its own way, it's become a bit more visually stimulating than just pure material for what it was intended to be. So there's this idea of process and material, but then the material in itself is changing and adapting.
I found them very rich in association. I found myself thinking about all kinds of things, but I mean, I even found some somewhat erotic content in there. But speaking to a woman who was, I guess, invigilating at the gallery, she spoke at length about her sense that these works were associated with Eva's reflection on and concern about the Holocaust, and I found that credible as well. I hadn't made that connection. I'm not sure how well established that connection is, because I haven't read of it anywhere else. Not that I've read deeply onto what people have written about Eva Hesse, but yeah. So I mean, my associations were with the kinds of things like clothing, and particularly kind of flimsy clothing and bedding, and so that was the connection I was making with something potentially, anyway.
Well, aside from repetition, they're all very textile based and material based, but it's just different materials that are being used instead of a curtain or instead of, drapery. And it feels soft, but it's actually hard. Or I don't know,
Yeah, there's certainly the material is matters, but the first piece you saw as you came in, the repetition, I think it's repetition 1. That made me think of the show that Graham Nixon, the longtime dean at the studio school, curated of Bruce Gagne's figures, full figures. And a few years ago, I forget exactly when, he filled the main gallery at the school with, I think, 9 or 10 figures, arranged in what struck me as remarkably similar way to the way that those, whatever you want to call them, cylinders, baskets, are set up in that repetition piece of hers, and that all of Bruce's figures can be described as, or he has described them to me as, there's being a kind of awkwardness at the heart of them. And awkward is Bruce's word. Hess's word is absurdity, or it comes up regularly in the bits and pieces I've read about her. And I sort of trying to take issue a bit with your saying that there's sort of no content. And there is a real content for me, or the absurdity and the deep kind of sadness of, the Holocaust and her moving from Germany with her parents, or moving out of Germany, and then her illnesses. That sadness is part of the work.
Yeah, I mean, repetition is the title of a small number of works, but it's an essential factor in much of what she did.
Yeah.
I mean, most of these works could be called repetition.
Yeah.
And they are now displayed in a way like that piece called Repetition, now on a very low wooden, presumed wooden plinth with a glass or plexiglass vitrine over it, makes it into something that presumably it wasn't when she made it. I mean, they could, all these things could be kind of like, if you found them in another context, could be thought things that have been thrown away. There's a sense in which you could, dismiss them all if you found them elsewhere as rubbish.
Yeah, they're absurd. Yeah. They're expanded expansion. There's, what a silly title. Mm-hmm. But that absurdity is at the heart, claiming this to be art.
I think that absurdity that she mentions herself. It exists in the context of those titans of minimalism and the giant works and permanent materials and the sheer self-importance. But I think it vanishes. And now, I don't think of them as absurd in the slightest. And it came out for me looking at I don't remember the title of the piece, leaning against the wall, how imposing, how impressive it is. And really, it has a monumental effect that I find lacking in those arcs of Richard Serra's.
Yeah.
For me, at this point, those are more absurd than her work. Because her work can be done by a person. It can even be put away somewhere. And Serra's work is like a kind of elephantine grandiosity, that the public can witness in an institutional space, and then it goes home to its billionaire.
Yeah, that the piece you're referencing as monumental is monumental, but it is also delicate and fragile. There's a contradiction built into a lot of the work, which I think
it's area you're talking about.
But I'm not perceiving that as absurd. Fragility.
No, because I don't think there's any. I find very little underlying humor in the work.
I think it's very playful, though, because I think especially this one you're referring against the wall, expanded expansion, it can be moved around, and this is made up of several different pieces of those rods. So just because it's been presented in this way, if Hesse was alive, I wonder how all of these pieces would have been arranged. It could have, because this is in a section of 247, it could have been arranged or installed as a different order number, or that there's that humor or playfulness or cheekiness that she has there, that nothing's really contained. It could be in any way, but it is so contained in relationship to each unit that it's made up of in all of these pieces.
Yeah, the absurdity it's absurd in the biggest sense. And remember in college, I learned about the theater of the absurd, and Beckett and Genet and Ionesco. They were very serious artists, and yet, absurdity was at the heart, and it's that serious kind of absurdity that she just naturally engaged with.
I'm aware of a certain playfulness and double entendre and kind of thing, but it's light in the sense that it's almost like a courtesy, that one has a certain wit about what one does and the seriousness with which one does it. But I don't as Garth is saying, I don't find something actually jocular there, and the absurdity, I'm kind of the fragility I'm seeing in terms of the disproportion that all of us suffer as living things in a world, in a universe so much greater than ourselves. Inconceivably greater. I find a bit of that in there.
Yeah,
the thinness of the almost like parchment-like material, and the translucence, the fact that it's just leaning against a wall.
I think Brandt is right. I think that the concept of absurdity is relevant only in the context of that she was working in relation to the ethos of minimalism and hard steel boxes, that she probably had to account for what she was doing by being, kind of offhanded about it and almost, apologetic almost. I think it's hard for me to consider, to feel, to experience a sense of ridiculousness, wackiness, playfulness perhaps. I mean, but not the kind of or the kind of bitterness that I think comes with the theatre of the absurd. I mean, the sort of tragicness that you find in Beckett or something,
yes,
is very present. I think,
right.
But it's they are just. I find now, deeply moving.
I don't think Hesse was trying to be absurd. I think her life was very complex.
Yeah.
And what it seems is that the process of making with material was her way of navigating the world or understanding the material. And so I think what's come out is really just a raw and unedited version of who she is. So I don't think she's trying to make wacky work. She's just making. And we're seeing what her investigations are being put out there. It's just very pure in her process.
And directness.
I mean, if I think about the context in which she was making these things, it must have taken some kind of extraordinary, what would be the word, courage, recklessness, abandonment to make these things. They're quite unprecedented in relation, I think, to what was going on at the time, and she may well have felt that she had to say, they're absurd.
Seeing this show without drawings, without some of the earlier things on the wall, you'd have a completely different impression of her work as a whole. That there's a lighter touch and another side, a lighter side of sensibility that is in her work that's not visible in this exhibition at all.
That's probably true, and I think but for me anyway, the kind of suggestion of an erotic content comes out in some of the drawings, very strongly.
And even some of the wall sculptures, which I agree, this is a very different contemplative experience. And that's, I think, what I was talking about without saying they have no content. It's like there's nothing feels overbearing.
Well, there's plenty of content, but there's no message.
No message. Like there's definitely emotional content, but it didn't feel like she was trying to do anything.
No,
just felt it was there as an experience.
I wanted to say, and I was going to censor myself, there's an everyday quality about these things. I'm not sure what I mean by that, but I guess the materials are not, they're not precious. The way things are made, you could, once you knew how to do it, you could do it yourself. There's no evident kind of high tech or great skill evidenced. And they're not that they don't seek to impress you with that kind of technical expertise or precious material or high finish or
Yeah. But there's a certain amount of mystery to, what is that made out?
Yeah.
And the way it captures light, I think Mel Bochner said something about her pieces being sculpture made out of light, and it's somehow denser, more full than Richard Serra solid steel, whatever he makes. She just with that sort of mysterious stuff, whether it's fiberglass, who knows what it is, but
it's a profoundly different undertaking from Sarah, and it almost is a kind of, to make a comparison, I think is just kind of almost, there's almost no connection.
Yeah, there's some connection in the materiality, or it's a connection that's a disconnection, really. But it's you're saying an everyday material. It's not an everyday. There's a sort of mystery to it.
Yeah, I wasn't saying everyday material, or that's not necessarily what I was not saying. I mean, there's a kind of what do I think? What am I trying to say? There's a kind of
there's a visceral rawness, or there's something very relatable that feels everyday, or feels. I agree with you with what you're saying.
Yeah, it's.
But the irony of it is that at the time she was making these, they were very high-tech materials and new materials at the time. Like for us, they're quite standard now, but when when they were being introduced, they were sort of these unknown chemical compounds that people were learning about that artists hadn't really.
Well, yeah, fiberglass was beginning to be widely used. Latex was not. And I doubt anybody's going to use latex these days. It's so quickly deteriorates. And that we're privileged to see these things because they must be kept, I think, in a cold, dark space in order to preserve them.
And it'll be a distinctly different experience in another 10 years.
Quite possibly. Quite possibly.
I mean, it's a real possibility that they'll, disintegrate practically entirely. I mean, that one piece did already. That her pessimism and her pessimism about the methods she's using, the life of the material she's using, using materials to create obscurity, one material covering another and generating opacity. I think those things are inherently psychological and absolutely and immediately germane to her emotional world. And that stuff comes out powerfully, probably more than ever, as the materials aged, and it becomes so much more visually evidently fragile than ever it was before. I mean, it had a certain slightness and physical lightness in terms of weight at the time, especially in contrast to other contemporary art. But now, I mean, that piece that folds down the wall and away, it looks like if you were to touch it, it would crumble. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Like the most brittle old brown paper, an old paperback.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, one does wonder what one would have, what kind of an experience it would have been to see these things when they were brand new,
Yeah.
What
I mean, a fiberglass jug on the floor at that time was a hardy object that you could nudge with your foot, and it would laugh at that. And
I think just talking about the beauty of them, I want to touch them. Everyone that goes in there, and if they didn't have those tapings, gets told to step back. There is this need to be touching the material, being with it, and there's something much more physical happening than the conscious mind is that I'm aware of when I'm experiencing it.
But the thing is, the impulse to touch is something that, obviously she felt, and it is a sort of legitimate doorway.
Well, I mean, they're so clearly and richly made by hand. I mean, these things are just full of somebody, with their hands in stuff, doing things with it.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.